your nearness, Lord, I hunger. For your nearness, Lord, I wait. Hold me ever closer, Father, with such a love I can't escape. For your nearness I am hoping. For your nearness, Lord, I long. Have no need of any other. I have found where I belong. Yes, I have found where I belong. So draw me nearer, Lord. Never let me go. Closer to your heart. Draw me nearer, Lord. Draw me nearer, Lord. In your nearness there is healing. What was broken now made whole. Restoration in its full. Lasting hope for all who come. In your nearness I take shelter. Where you are is where I'm home. I have need of only one thing, to be here before your throne. To be here before your throne. So draw me nearer, Lord. Never let me go. Closer to your heart. Draw me nearer, Lord. So draw me nearer, Lord. Never let me go. Closer to your heart. Draw me nearer, Lord. Draw me nearer, Lord. And keep me here, keep me here. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. So keep me here, keep me here. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. So draw me nearer, Lord. Never let me go. Closer to your heart. Draw me nearer, Lord. Draw me nearer, Lord. Draw me nearer, my Lord.
I really appreciate Linda singing the song, and it really ties in well with the message this morning. And also, I heard that you had a message last Sabbath that the message today will tie in with at least somewhat. But the song that Linda sang, it ties in as far as, it says, you may have seen Linda pass the words off to me, but hold me ever closer, Father, with such a love I can't escape. that kind of sums up, in here what I want to discuss today. And I've got several props here. I may not use all of them, and hopefully my most important one won't fall off in the hole down here where I can't get it. What I would like to discuss today is that, our Heavenly Father is creating a family, and family is very important to God. That's what it's all about. And God created the perfect family unit. The husband and father, the wife and mother, the son and the daughter. And those are all very, very important roles. And what I want to discuss today is what is the most neglected of those roles within a family unit in our society. And it's really unfortunate that it's that way. I'm very passionate about this subject, and the reason is because our daughter, our daughter Tiffany is 37 and our son Chris is 36. Our daughter and I have always had a very close relationship, which I treasure, and I would take nothing for that. On the other hand, my wife, Linda, never knew her dad until she was 33 years old. So we've experienced both extremes of that. And I always really miss, and obviously Linda missed too her whole life, not having a father. And I always missed not having a father-in-law, which would have been really nice. And I always missed for our children, and they missed too, not having their other grandfather. And so this may on the surface seem like, the subject may seem of the importance of the relationship between a father and his daughter, may seem like, well, that doesn't apply to me, or that only applies to a father and a young daughter. That is absolutely not true. And I don't see a lot of kids running around here, but it still applies to every one of us. We're all either a father, or we're a daughter, or we're the son of a daughter. So it applies to all of us. The title of the book, Why a Daughter Needs a Dad, 100 Reasons, and it was written by Gregory E. Lang, L-A-N-G. I don't know that I've ever opened this book and read my daughter's notes in it without bringing tears to my eyes. And it especially means a lot to me that I remember when I was a kid in grade school and in junior high and high school going to the feast, and the laborious chore of trying to work ahead in your books so you wouldn't be behind when you get back. In my case, I don't think that ever happened. I don't ever remember getting back and being caught up. But I do remember sitting in the back seat with my two brothers, looking out the window as we drove from Indiana to Jekyll Island, Georgia, or Indiana to Big Sandy. I do remember looking out the window and savoring the different topography and climates and all of that. And my story is that's an education in itself, and it is. But I mentioned that because our daughter bought this book for me shortly before the feast, after she had gotten her bachelor's degree and was in law school. And in law school, they really kicked their tail to try to weed out the weak ones. And it's a lot harder anyway than obviously high school or college. But in spite of that, Tiffany took the time and wrote personal notes to me on probably at least half of these pages of how each of these reasons why a daughter needs a dad relates to mine and Tiffany's relationship. And the book is mostly just pictures, like a picture of a dad and his young daughter, and then one of the 100 reasons here why the daughter needs a dad. I treasure this book more than about any gift I've ever received. And our daughter Tiffany, she lets Linda think that she's her mother's little girl, but she's not. She's her daddy's girl. She promised me when she was a little girl that she would always be my little girl, and she reaffirmed that again here recently. No, not really. I'm getting the sign that she's got me wrapped around her little finger. Not really, but kind of, sort of, maybe. So, and it's always been an honor to me to be known as, well, I'll back up a little bit. You know, it's when you have a young family, your children are little, your children are usually known by, well, that's Morris and Linda's daughter or son. But it's really interesting, and I like it as they grow older, then the parents become, oh, that's Tiffany and Chris's dad and mom. And I like that. I think that's the way it should be, because they grow into their own identity. And I've always considered it an honor to be Linda's husband and to be Tiffany and Chris's father. Linda and I have been hugely blessed with two wonderful children. We had kind of planned on having three, but I'm happy with what we've got. So this subject applies to everybody. Like I said, nobody gets off the hook. And as I mentioned, I don't see a bunch of little kids running around here, but I'm sure many of you fathers have daughters, and those daughters still need you, and they still look at your example. They still need your example. And there's also obviously women here that are mothers and have sons or daughters. And this subject, I know from experience, can be a very sensitive subject. And so my hope is to navigate through the subject and be helpful in encouraging good relationships between fathers and their daughters, and for those daughters who have, whether they're grown or not. And I've talked to a good number of ladies grown, and one I think the first time I gave this message a good number of years ago, a lady who was in her late 70s or around 80 called me. She wasn't there. She was watching on the Cybercast or a phone hookup. And she called me in tears and told me her experience. And I've had that happen numerous times, of the pain. Us men and fathers need to realize how important that relationship is with our daughter. It in so many ways and on so many levels, but I've had numerous ladies, elderly ladies, tell me, and with tears in their eyes, how much it still hurts because they never had that close relationship with their dad. So fathers, it's our responsibility to build that strong relationship with our daughter from the time she's born. And before that, and I used to talk to our daughter before she was born, when she was in Linda's stomach. And I did our grandson too, and granddaughter. Tiffany and Chris had a favorite book when they were little, one of the little golden books. I think it was a golden, little child's book. The title was The Bear in the Boat. And that was their favorite story, and I've pretty much memorized it. I mean, you know, I read it so many times. But before our grandson was born, and I think our granddaughter too, I would put my mouth down to Tiffany's stomach, and I would recite The Bear in the Boat. But it's our job to build that special relationship, and I know that hasn't happened in far too many cases. So if that relationship has not existed, now's the time to start it. It's never too late. Let's turn to Deuteronomy chapter 6. This first point is the importance of the father's role. Deuteronomy chapter 6, and we'll read verses 6 through 9. This is part of us as fathers' responsibility. Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting in verse 6. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and they shall walk of them, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. And I've found that I used to, a good number of years ago, I used to kind of beat myself up because we didn't have more regimented Bible studies, or however you want to define it. But on the other hand, I think there's teachable moments, and we're all most apt to learn something and receive something when we're experiencing a given situation. And I think that's something that we need to be careful about, is make sure that we seize those opportunities. Like if a child is going through something at school, someone's not treating them right or whatever, that's the good time to sit them down and teach them out of God's Word and God's principles how those situations should be handled. In verse 8, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. It's our job as fathers to reflect our Heavenly Father to our children, so they will know what God's like. Unfortunately, far too many people have never had that proper example. And therefore, it makes it more difficult for them to develop a relationship with their father, because they might think, well, I don't know if I can trust him, or all these different things. He hasn't kept his word, talking about their physical father, and then that kind of transfers over naturally to God the Father. So it's really important that we live our lives following God, and so that when our children look at us, they see the reflection of the Father. That's a pretty awesome responsibility. A daughter needs her father's love. That's not just the mother's job. The daughter especially needs love from her father. And if a father does not show proper love to his daughter, she will seek that love through other men and other boys. And often they become sexually promiscuous because they just crave that love from their father. If they don't get it there, they're likely to try to find it somewhere, and it's not going to be love. It's going to be something that kind of sort of feels like love, but it's not love, it's lust. Quite often. It's the father's role to prepare his daughter for the kind of man that she will eventually marry. And when I say that, I'm not saying to set her down and say, okay, here's what you want to look for. You want to look for this, and you want to look for that, and you want to look for that. No, we show our daughters the kind of man she needs to marry by our example. We can use all the words we want, tell somebody to do something, but especially our children, that all comes down to our example. How did Dad do it? How did Mom do it? So we as fathers, whether we like it or not, the reality is a daughter, when she gets married, if her father was an alcoholic, she knows that. She doesn't like it, but she knows that she's going to be drawn to marrying an alcoholic. If her father was abusive, including physical abuse, that's a known commodity to her. Even though she doesn't like it, doesn't like the abuse, she tends to be drawn to that. The statistics bear this out, that more often than not, she's drawn to the abusive man if her father was abusive. We need to make sure she's drawn to the loving gentleman. We've got to be that loving gentleman, and then she will learn by our example. When she sees a gentleman, she can identify that's a gentleman. So now I'm going to read my top 10 favorite reasons why a daughter needs a dad out of this book. I'll start at number 10 and work down to my favorite one. A daughter needs a dad so she will always know what it's like to be someone's favorite. Our daughter Tiffany wrote in this book, that's the best part. Number 9, a daughter needs a dad to be the safe spot she can always turn to. Our daughters always need to know that they can come to us. Even if it's a situation we don't want to hear. We have to be loving, and we have to know that they're comfortable with coming to us and discussing it so we can work through it. Otherwise, if they mess up or whatever the situation is, if they're just going through something difficult, they don't come to us, then no telling what they're going to do. We need to know that they can always approach us, and we will help them work through it. Number 8, a daughter needs a dad to be the standard against which she will judge all men. when our daughter sees a boy, they become dating age, and they see this rough crowd over here and these boys that only want one thing. That I always told our daughter, boys only want one thing. And that's pretty much true. There's some exceptions out there, but in our society, that's pretty much true. So it's a good premise to start with. So we need to reflect the righteousness of God and godly standards so that she will be drawn to the right type of man, and so that she will have the right measuring stick to measure other boys and men by. Number 7, a daughter needs a dad to teach her what it means to always be there. And even, that's not just until she graduated from high school. That's when she's in college, or after she graduates from high school, or when she's 70 years old. If we're still here, our daughter needs to know we're here for her. Number 6, and this one, I'll get to the rest of the story regarding Linda's dad here shortly, but this one I can never read this statement without thinking of Linda's dad. A daughter needs a dad to teach her that a man's strength is not in the force of his hand or his voice, but in the kindness of his heart. That's the epitome. Once we got to know Linda's dad, that was Linda's dad. Number 5, a daughter needs a dad to hold her as she cries. Number 4, a daughter needs a dad to set a moral standard for her so that she knows this is what our standards are. This was mom and dad's standards. These are my standards. It's our job to lay out godly standards for our daughters, and then hopefully our daughters will adopt those same godly standards as her standards. But if she doesn't see that, if we just say, well, this is what you need to do, but we don't live it, that's going to be pretty much totally meaningless. Number 3, a daughter needs a dad who will influence her life even when he isn't there. For example, when they go off to college. And I've always appreciated and still do that every once in a while our daughter will call, and we've never tried to cram things down her throat. She was always a strong-willed child, which is a pretty strong-willed child, and which is a good thing if it's properly channeled and directed. And she properly channeled it and directed it. But I've always appreciated that Tiffany would call us from college or different times and to get our advice on things. Number 2, why a daughter needs a dad: to teach her by his example how to recognize a gentleman, which we've already discussed. And then my number 1 favorite, which is at a certain point in life, up to that point, the culmination of all of these. My number 1 favorite: a daughter needs a dad to stand with her on the day that she marries the man that she hopes will be just like her father. And I have to say, from the time Tiffany was a little girl, I always prayed that God would set her aside and help her be raised to be a godly young lady and wife. And I always prayed certain things that God would save a very special young man to be her husband. And Tiffany and Dustin got married, it'll be 13 years ago next month. And it's like the toast I made at their wedding. I mentioned that I had always prayed for Tiffany from the time she was a little girl about the man she would marry. And I'm proud to say that God gave us far more in our son-in-law Dustin than I ever dreamed to ask. I ask a lot of things, but I'm fond of saying that I think Dustin is the most wonderful son-in-law in the world. He's a wonderful provider. He's a wonderful, godly man. Our children and their mates are all baptized into the church. He's funny. He's just all. I don't know what else a person would want for a son-in-law. He's a very good father, and he's a very good son-in-law. Let's turn to Colossians chapter 3, verses 20 through 22. While you're turning there, I'll throw in one more of my favorite reasons just as a bonus. A daughter needs a dad to be the one hero who will never let her down. Colossians chapter 3, verses 20 through 22. And I'm sorry, I'm going to read this out of the Amplified. Maybe you can follow along. It's kind of hard for me to follow along in one translation when it's being read out of another one. Verse 20. Children, obey your parents as God's representatives in all things, for this attitude of respect and obedience is well-pleasing to the Lord and will bring you God's promised blessings. That's to the children. Now to the fathers. Verse 21. Fathers, do not provoke or irritate or exacerbate your children with demands that are trivial or unreasonable or humiliating or abusive, nor by favoritism or indifference. Treat them tenderly with loving kindness, so they will not lose heart and become discouraged or unmotivated with their spirits broken. I'm going to read a quote out of another book. It's titled "Always Daddy's Girl," and it was written by H. Norman Wright, and this quote is from page 41. He says, "It is from a father that a girl needs to know that she is attractive, that her conversation is interesting, and that her creativity is worthwhile. If a father applauds her mental and spiritual attributes during her formative years, she will learn not to rely solely on shallow qualities of sex appeal to attract men as an adult." It's a father's responsibility to affirm his daughter and her value. If we don't do that, we leave her hugely defenseless. We need to affirm the affirmation from her father in proper doses. We don't want to overdo it, but we do want to do it properly and sufficiently. Proper doses will convince her that she is an important person, not a sex object. We as fathers need to bring out the best in our daughters by our good example and our godly instruction and by encouragement. The encouragement is very important. Webster's definition of courage is 1, to give courage, hope, confidence, embolden, to hearten. And then also number 2, to help, give support to, be favorable to. And this last word, I like to use it, it's foster, my last name. And most of the time when I hear that word foster, it's used in a negative connotation, like it fostered disagreement or that type thing. It doesn't have to be like that. We can use foster in a positive sense, like this. So it's our job as fathers to give confidence to our daughters and also to help discover her God-given talents. We all have God-given talents. We need to help her discover hers. God has given her special talents and a special purpose. I've told Tiffany ever since she was little and that God has a special purpose for her, and I still believe that. And I've gotten to see little windows into it. I'm anxious to see the full story, but I know God has a special purpose for her. And she has a special purpose for our son and for all of us. But we as fathers need to not just wake up and go to work every day and then come home and turn on the TV or go to a second job or whatever. There's nothing more important than our families. Our families, our job as fathers is a God-given responsibility. Amen. And I know in growing up in the church, I've seen this far too often that people have assignments at church, which is good, and those need to be done, but way too often that's done to the sacrifice of the family. And people see it when we go to church and we do whatever our contribution is, which is good and needful, but there's times when we need to say, I can't do that. My first responsibility is this life that God gave my wife and I. It's our daughter, and I've got to spend time with our daughter and our son and my wife. So it's our job to make sure that we help our daughters discover her abilities. And if we notice, we'll notice, like, she does exceptionally well in this category here. She does really well in this too. And in this category, not so well in these other things, which is fine, because none of us excel in everything. But we need to help her discover what those abilities are that God gave her and help her develop those. And not to be confused with some pipe dream we had when we were young that we never fulfilled. That day is gone. This day is about our daughter, to help her discover her abilities. And we never want to kill her spirit. When our daughter was pretty little, not a whole lot past learning to walk, my wife has always loved singing. She's passionate about singing. And for some reason, Tiffany would go to the dirty clothes hamper, and she would get dirty clothes out, and she would hang them around her neck. Then she'd go through the house singing. And it really was not very good. It was not pretty. But I never said anything to her because I did not want to kill her spirit. And, I would be thinking, like, please let her be finished. But I never said anything that would quench her spirit, and she went on to learn to sing really good. She sings at the feast a lot of times, weddings, funerals. She has a great voice. But we always want to be, it's always important not to tell our children, well, you can't do this, or you could never do that. We need to do the opposite. And I heard on the radio just a few years ago, a DJ was on, and he was telling a story about, he had a young daughter, and she was singing, and he told her, don't ever do that. Don't ever sing again. You can't sing. That just tore my heart out. No telling what she could have gone on to do if he hadn't killed her spirit like that. Conversely, on the other side, I heard a story about this little girl named Annie. And her uncle was visiting at their house, and she was getting ready to go to bed, and her uncle told her, said, Annie, I think you're the smartest little girl I know. And Annie says, I know that. And then he went on to say, and I think you can do about anything you want to do. She said, I know. And then he said, and you're also a very pretty little girl. And she said, I know that too. And the uncle said, Annie, how do you know all that? And she said, because my daddy tells me every day. That's what we daddies should do. Some things that our daughters need to know, and our sons too, they need to know that we're in love with their mother. That is hugely important and comforting to them to know that. And our daughters also need to know that we love them to the core of our being. That what we tell them to do is not out of some selfish motive on our own part to make us look good, but it's for their good. And they know that. Kids are pretty smart. You have to wake up pretty early to get something past a kid. And I think one of the biggest deficiencies historically has been that we haven't loved our children like we should. And if our children should never question our love or our motives, they should know by our example and our experience that when what we have them do, and what we do and what we have them do is with pure intention, and it's for their good. And that will go a long way if they know that to the core of their being. It's also very important that we as fathers validate our daughters. When our kids were little and still, when we go out, they both and their families live out of state. When we go visit them, I can hardly walk by. Of course, when we see them, I give Tiffany a big hug. I give her son-in-law a big hug, or son. We have what we call the dad hug. Chris and I have this special hug. We hug real tight like that and then slap the back 3 times. That's our hug. But I can hardly walk past them, even though if we've been there for a week or a month, I can hardly walk by them without giving them a pat that the kids always call the dad pat. So our daughter needs to know from us, from Dad, that she's a worthy human being, that she's intelligent, that she's beautiful, and also physically she needs to have the confidence We need to instill the confidence in her that she has physical beauty, and also that the most greatest beauty of all comes right here from the heart, from the inside. And again, I'll read this one quote from the book. A man's strength is not in the force of his hand or the power of his voice, but in the kindness of his heart. We fathers need to expose our hearts to our daughters, to our families, and certainly to our daughters too. And we all make mistakes. I make plenty of mistakes, but we as fathers cannot pretend like, well, we're perfect and you're a kid and you're not. No, when we make a mistake, if we kind of lash out in anger because we're upset or stressed or something at our children, we need to apologize to them. It's not their job just to take that, be lashed out at in anger. Or whatever the offense is, we need to be sensitive to them and their needs, and we need to admit when we do wrong, treat them wrongly, we need to recognize that. Or even if it's somebody else. If we treated some stranger wrong, or maybe somebody we should have helped, when we recognize that, we need to tell our children that, I'm sorry, I set a wrong example, this is what I should have done. And that does not give our children disrespect for us when we do that. It does the opposite. It endears our children to us. They know that we're human and we're trying to do the best we can. Sometimes we mess up. When we do, we recognize it and apologize for it. We should also catch her doing good. Our tendency is to overlook the good, and just when we see, well, you messed up there, and then call her out on that and punish them or whatever the circumstance is. The most effective thing by far is if the wrong, if it can be overlooked, if it can't always be overlooked, but if it's not severe enough to where it cannot be overlooked, the most productive thing is to watch for our children doing good and compliment them on that, because when we speak something, we give life to it with words, and they tend to be drawn toward what we give life to. If we're continually being critical, we're giving life to them messing up. But the things that we can overlook, which is not everything, because sometimes they do need to be corrected, but the things that we can overlook, if we give life to that with our words and compliment them on this and that and that and that, they're drawn to that. Something else very important our daughters need to know is that we, as their father, are very proud of them. I asked here just a few years ago, I asked my wife, our daughter, and a dear friend of ours the same question. And again, my wife grew up without her dad. Tiffany and I have always been blessed with a great relationship. Our dear friend grew up with her dad, but it was not a good experience. They did not have, because he tended to be, I think, at least verbally abusive and was not the father he should have been. So I asked all three of them, my wife, our daughter, and our dear friend, what is the most important thing that a daughter needs to know from her dad? Do you know what it was? All three of them, I asked them independently on separate occasions, all three of them said exactly the same thing, that the daughter needs to know that her dad is proud of her. That's something we need, and it's not good enough. I found out later that the dear friend, her dad had told other people that he was proud of her, but he never told her that he was proud of her. And he died here just within the last few years. And I think maybe he did before he died, but why waste 80 years? We need to tell her from day one. And if that's never happened, from this day, that we're proud of her, and tell her why. When our daughters are born, we as fathers are our daughter's first introduction into the opposite sex. She's going to judge boys and men by us. It's our job to make sure that we treat her mother as a lady and with respect. And it's also our job to make sure we teach our daughter with respect and as a young lady. I was honored when we lived in Hickory Creek, Texas, just north of Louisville, and I was honored to take Tiffany to her first dance in grade school. It was a daddy-daughter dance, and I got to buy her first corsage. And that was really special. And it's also important that we fathers take our daughters on daddy-daughter dates, like maybe once a week, just you and your daughter. And if you have more than one daughter, then, and I don't care if they're grown, I don't care if they're 70, still good to take your daughter on a date and develop that relationship, especially if it's never been developed like it should have been previously. I was out visiting our daughter and our son and daughter and their families. I think it was 2 years ago when I was out there, and there was a yogurt shop several miles away. So the plan was I was going to take our grandson Ben to yogurt for just he and I for a while, and then later take our granddaughter Addie to the yogurt shop. So Ben and I went to the yogurt shop. He's my little red-headed buddy, 8 years old. He's a little pistol, a little firecracker. He's a great little kid. And I know God has a special purpose for him. And Tiffany mentioned to me back here probably a couple years ago, she said, "Dad, you always told me that God had a special purpose for me?" I said, "Yes." And Tiffany said, "If that's the case, I think God has a special purpose for Ben too," which I'm sure he does. I know he does. Ben's a sharp little guy. And he's got red hair too. I'll mention that again. I love it. But anyway, I took Ben to the yogurt shop, and at the yogurt shop, the table was a little bigger than this, and it had, I think it was a built-in checkerboard with a glass top, and you could sit there and play checkers, or maybe it was tic-tac-toe. I think that's what it was. You could sit there and play a game while you eat the yogurt. So Ben and I are sitting there. He's like 6 years old then, and we're sitting there playing tic-tac-toe. And it, I had a really enjoyable time with Ben. And then we went back home, and then I think it was later on that day, I took Addie to our granddaughter, who would have been about 4 at that time. Addie and I went to the yogurt shop for a papa-granddaughter date. And we're sitting there eating. I just found this fascinating. I think she had her back to the door. I was facing the door. I saw this lady walk in, had this long, beautiful dress. And Addie are sitting there talking. And Addie sees this lady, and she just turns around and looks. And she just stared. She didn't break eye contact the whole time, or contact looking with the lady. She just watched the lady walk down to the other end of the shop to order her yogurt. And she was just in awe. She was just fascinated. She was checking out this lady's dress, her mannerisms. I don't know what all she was checking out, but she was just spellbound by watching this lady. Ben didn't do that. Ben's all boy. Addie's all girl. And I told Tiffany when we got back to their house, I told her, this was a totally different experience taking Ben to the yogurt shop and taking Addie to the yogurt shop, because Addie's all girl and Ben's all boy. And I got a kick out of Tiffany's response was, yeah, we get that a lot from other people that keep their kids. So we fathers, we are our daughter's first courtship. We need to make sure we get it right and show her how a gentleman treats a lady. And we need to make sure that she knows she is a well-able child of God. I remember as Tiffany entered puberty, it became kind of uncomfortable for me, because I'm like, it's kind of awkward. I don't know, should I still hug her? What should I do? The answer is, we as fathers, we do what we always did. We still love our daughters. We hug our daughters. There's no difference. I remember it hasn't been that many years ago, Tiffany coming and sitting in my lap. I love that. And a news flash, I was discussing this with Tiffany just a few years ago. This was a big news flash to me, which should have been a no-brainer, but I was telling her, about how it can be uncomfortable for a father as his daughter enters puberty, not knowing how to interact with her father. The big news flash for me was, Tiffany said, well, it's the same thing for the daughter, because the daughter's never had those changes in her body before. I mean, that should have been a no-brainer, but that was just a news flash for me. On this subject, back here a few weeks ago, I watched several YouTube videos, which I've pretty much quit watching TV. I get fascinated by watching a lot of neat YouTube videos that you can learn a lot from. But I watched, you might want to write this down, Dr. Meg Meeker, M-E-G, first name Meg, M-E-G, and then Meeker, M-E-E-K-E-R. She wrote a book titled Strong Fathers, Strong Daughters. And I watched, I think, 6 of her YouTube videos that were about 6 minutes each. But she just nailed this subject. I mean, she was, on everything I saw on her YouTube videos, it was excellent. I'm probably going to give, I'd like to give the rest of this right now, but I think I'm going to break it up into 2 messages, so the next time that we come over, I can give the part 2 to this, which is basically the daughter's role, and her role is just, part of her role is just like what Tiffany did, that's mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 5. She honored her father by, and she validated me. It's important for the daughters to be validated by the fathers, but it's also important for the fathers to be validated by the daughters, to have that same love returned to them. And that will be one of the points. And then another one is, and this is a really important category, is the reality is probably most daughters have not had that relationship with their father like they should have. And it's normally the father's fault, because it's his responsibility to build that relationship from the time she's born or before. And so this point will be about, even though it's the father's responsibility, if you're a daughter that's never had that proper relationship, things that you could do to help, things that maybe you could do to help bring that relationship about if he's still alive. And then the other category will be our responsibility to the fatherless, which gets back to what I mentioned earlier, that even if we've never had children and never will have children, we still have a responsibility to be a father to the fatherless. When Linda was 33, we received a phone call telling her who her father was. It was E.M. Clayton that lived near Lawrenceburg, Tennessee. It basically had to do with divorce and remarriage in the Worldwide Church of God back in the 50s. And so her mother was told to move to Big Sandy from Tennessee, which is why, we didn't know this. It's been a process of discovery. Linda's mother died, biological mother died at the age of 93, April 15th of this year. And so these things have been a process of discovery over the last 43 years that we've been married. But we got a phone call that E.M. Clayton was Linda's dad. And there's other miraculous circumstances involved that I might share with you at another time, but I can prove mathematically that it was miraculous circumstances. I've done the math on it, and the odds of this happening are in the billions to 1. But that's a story for another time. But Linda called her dad up in Tennessee, and she asked him if she could call him Daddy. And he said yes. So a few days later, we packed up the car and drove up to Tennessee, to Lawrenceburg. And they lived about 7 miles south of town. And we got up there. Linda's dad and her stepmother are just the nicest people you could ever hope to meet. I mean, just kind, down home, godly. Come to find out, they'd been in the church all those years. But I think they had been told, you need to separate. Linda's mother needs to move to Big Sandy, but God is a master at taking a bad situation and turning it into a really good situation. And even though Linda never knew her dad those first 33 years, we developed a really close, strong relationship with her dad and stepmom. And her stepmother is the quintessential mother and grandmother. She's just a wonderful person. And so we had almost 20, about 19 and a half years with Linda's dad, and we would go up to Tennessee frequently. We'd sometimes go to the feast together. They would come down here and visit. And it was great to have that relationship we never had. And her dad was, like I said with this one quote, that a man's strength is in the kindness of his heart, not in his voice or the force of his hand. That was so Linda's dad. And Isaiah 66:2, I think, where God says, to this man I will look, he who is humble and a contrite heart and trembles at my word. That's Linda's dad. And so we got a phone call 10 years ago that Linda's dad and stepmom both were really sick. So Linda and I packed up the truck, went up to Tennessee, and for an undetermined period of time, and over the course of 9 days, we took them to 12 different doctor and hospital visits, and we found out at that time that Linda's dad had colon cancer. And the doctors told him that he would have 2 good years. He had the surgery, which I was shocked, because he wouldn't take an aspirin, or he wouldn't go to the doctor. I was shocked that he agreed to have the surgery. Then after that, he said he wasn't taking the chemo or anything. They told him he'd have a couple good years. We didn't know if that meant you'd have 2 good years and then decline, or two good years total. And so it proved to be pretty much that way. It was about 2 years. And we got the phone call on a Friday afternoon. We went up there frequently during that period of time, and our children and their mates and grandchildren flew out from out of state to be up there for a family reunion that was had specifically for him, because he'd gotten really frail, and at that point I think he was in a wheelchair. He was declining pretty rapidly. So we all went up there for the family reunion. And then a couple months later, we got the call. We had got hospice set up for them up there. A couple months later, we got the call that looks like this is it. So we loaded up the truck, got up there to their house south of Lawrenceburg about 2 or 2:30 in the morning, and he was in his hospital bed there by the windows, or picture window in the living room. And we got there, like I said, about 2:30 in the morning. And June, Linda's stepmother, said, "Your dad wrote me a love note tonight." And she said, "And he wants to write you one tomorrow." So by the next day, he wasn't able to talk at that point, I don't think. He could, write just a little bit. He was really emaciated, like the pictures you see from people that were in the concentration camps. And the next morning, June, Linda's stepmother, got a piece of paper and a pen and reminded E.M. that he wanted to write Linda a love note. And this is a note right here. All he was able to write at that time was the word love. But he pointed to Linda and pointed to me. And I love this. You can look at this picture later. Linda is a spitting image of her dad. There's no denying that she's his daughter. And we always really appreciated, from the first time we went up there, they attended the Worldwide Church of God at that time, and then in '93 they because of the apostasy that was going on, they started attending Global, which then partly became Living. But they would take us to church. All the people there, a congregation about this size, a little bit bigger, they had no idea E.M. Clayton had a daughter, other than they had a daughter that died when she was 13. But I always really appreciated that he was really proud of her. He was really proud of Linda. And they would take us around and introduce us to people, and people would be like, I know they'd be shocked, like, I had no idea you had a daughter. But it meant a lot that him and June were both proud of Linda and I and our children, and took us around and introduced us to everybody. but I really love this picture. This was at our house one of the times they came down to visit. They look so much alike, and I love that. I love when I look at Linda that I can see her dad in her too. So we got there on Saturday morning, about 2:30 in the morning. He didn't have long to live. Tuesday evening, I think it was, actually Linda and I had made the funeral arrangements, and we had left to go into town to finalize some of the arrangements. And while we were gone, just a short period of time, we got back and he had just died. And he was laying there in the bed, and I'll never forget this. Linda never got to cuddle up with her dad when she was a little girl. But, like I said, God is the master at taking a bad situation and turning it into a good situation. And if any of us have bad situations, we need to get it turned into a good situation. When Linda's dad died, she instinctively got up in the bed and cuddled up next to him. And that's my hope for everybody that hasn't had a good relationship, that they can build that proper, loving relationship between the father and the daughter. It's been a real pleasure to be here. We always, like I mentioned to some of you before when we got here, it's coming here is always like coming home. Even the first time we came when we didn't know anybody here. And it's amazing, and it's God's love that it's the same way when we go to Texarkana or Tyler or Haltom City. It's the same family. That's really a great feeling.
We're expecting part 2 real soon.
As soon as it can be scheduled, I'm looking forward to giving it. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not Wayne Woodring, a dear friend of ours. He wrote they have a wonderful daughter too, and he wrote a song. He's really good at singing and playing the guitar and songwriting. Wayne wrote a song for his daughter, and they played it live in Tyler last week. Wayne and Joanne weren't able to come today, so I think we've got the recording back here, the audio, that's going to be played now.
Your mother, and with the last alive.